Thank you, everybody, for being here. John, thank you for moderating. And I appreciate everybody who's really powering through. We're almost at the end. It's going to be good. Um, I especially want to note what I'm going to try to do here is maybe extend some of the things that we heard in John's plenary session. I was sweating a little bit because I was hoping he was not going to do an extended analysis of Kirchheimer's In Quest of Sovereignty, because that's what I'm going to do. And right, so I think we might hear some new stuff, but I want to sort of couch this in what I take this broader project to be and why I got interested in racket theory. Um, there's a composite photo of Karl Marx in Trier, right? And Horkheimer and Adorno are both listed as philosopher and sociologist, right? Herbert Marcuse is also in this composite photo, but he is described as an American philosopher of German origin. And so I was curious about this distinction, and so this started a whole notion of like, well, what does it mean to say Marcuse is an American? And so part of what I want to look at with this notion of racket theory is how I think Marcuse understood the term and what he received from Horkheimer, and how he and Kirchheimer, I think, made some use of some trends in American academic thought to sort of build a conception of rackets that might be a little different than the ones that we inherit from Horkheimer and Adorno. Um, so that's sort of the broader point here. And so in a letter to Horkheimer in 1942, Marcuse writes, I have looked up several books for concrete material on the problem of rackets, but the available sources here are utterly insufficient. The theoretical thesis we want to expound is so daring that it seems to me not enough to quote some more or less well-known books, and I wonder whether you should not ask Kirchheimer or Gerland to collect the material in New York. However, I shall do my best to gather whatever I can find, end quote. And so while, as we already heard, Horkheimer did develop the theory somewhat, its fragmentary sections are in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, Kirchheimer did sort of pick up the task a little bit, although maybe not in the way that was initially proposed. So I want to try to pick up some of these fragments then of racket theory, not only to see the differences in the way that the sort of Horkheimer and Adorno contingent deploy it versus I'm gonna pit them against each other. You have Horkheimer and Adorno with their sort of conception, and then Marcuse slash Kirchheimer on the other side. So we're gonna try to put those two in conversation. So while Marcuse and Horkheimer shared some correspondence, as I just mentioned, over some of these general components of racket theory, including Marcuse providing feedback on an essay that Horkheimer never published, neither of the two fully developed a systemic theory of rackets. Still, between the snippets in Horkheimer's writing as well as Marcuse's reference to the concept in some of his own essays, there are some fragments of what might be called a theory sort of emerged. But I want to argue that its most comprehensive expression you can find in the 1944 article by Otto Kirchheimer, In Quest of Sovereignty. Just as an interesting curiosity, Henrik Grossman, Friedrich Pollock also were invited to contribute to this discussion, both flatly refused for reasons that we all know, right? But before analyzing Kirchheimer's contribution, I'd like to sort of give some of the groundwork from Horkheimer and Marcuse in their deployment of the concept. As we've already heard from John, Horkheimer defines racket as gangster rule, and that it is the quote true nature of social domination. And I think here Horkheimer wades into a really kind of choppy waters, right? Because it becomes this trans-historical concept, as John mentioned, that and because it's always there, it becomes this overwhelming totality. It's difficult to see the constitutive outside from which you can critique it, right? In other words, it loses its dialectical valence. And so Marcuse, in his notes to Horkheimer, mentions this. Right? He says you need to pay attention to these what is he? Sorry. Marcuse says that we need to look for these outside edges of these structures where domination can never fully be complete. He warns Horkheimer that his discussion of labor rackets represents an analysis of sclerotic labor bureaucracies that have been fully integrated and rationalized into racket logic, but that this does not represent the entirety of class potential or of organized labor itself. In other words, there's other ways to look at this. Marcuse pushes Horkheimer to investigate the current dimensions of old categories like labor aristocracy to reflect the changing aspects of, quote, monopolistic and technological rationalization, increased efficiency and increased dependency, to find differences between old and new forms of labor organizing and the emancipatory potentials therein. So emphasizing the role of technological dynamism in organizations and society is, I argue, sort of one of the fortes of Marcuse in relation to the sort of first generation Frankfurt School. And he does so here as well. And so while Horkheimer and Adorno developed racket theory in a way that stressed its totality and its permeation into all spheres of life, Marcuse accepted a more sort of loose interpretation of a notion of rackets and then looked for ways to poke holes in that totality. And this sort of, I think he had this vision in mind when he was recruiting people to sort of work on the racket project, and Kirchheimer fit that bill. So this is a stealth paper at a Marcuse conference about Otto Kirchheimer. Sorry. And so, you know, I think there are some interesting notions from Horkheimer and Adorno. I'm not saying we need to just toss out that entire section of dialectic of enlightenment or whatever, but I suggest that Marcuse and Kirchheimer provide a lens to find differentiation within what otherwise looks like a totality of rackets. And like I said, I'm not sure Kirchheimer understood the project of rackets in the same way that Horkheimer and Adorno did, which maybe we're all the better for because we got this, you know, article in Quest of Sovereignty where Kirchheimer deploys rackets to make sense of the monopolistic tendencies of business organizations, as well as the legislative administrative apparatus that sustains monopolization. He also looks at the unique role of labor within and between these two forces. And so when Kirchheimer does introduce rackets, his definition is continuous with the way it was used by Horkheimer and Marcuse, if slightly scaled back. In other words, Kirchheimer says rackets are, quote, an establishment of domination over a segment of the process of production or distribution, right? So there's a continuity here. There's segmentation. I think of the sort of analogy of a kind of a churn, right? Like there's a temporal and spatial dimension to this, right? Where it's not just racket gets established, it's there for all time. You know, the power dynamics shift, some get larger, some get smaller, and things sort of move in this sort of churn. And I want to take a brief moment too to suggest that I really like what Kirchheimer's doing here because as I'm trained as a political scientist, and what Kirchheimer's doing is just decimating the sort of fancy liberal notions of American political science that say, well, you know, the way pluralistic democracy works is various interest groups get together in some abstract imaginary area and they just talk to each other and figure out what they all want from each other. And then the government makes that all happen for them. And that's democracy. Right? Kirchheimer is saying like, well, yeah, that's kind of what happens, but that's what rackets are, right? So you get this recasting of what American institutional politics looks like from this perspective of sort of racket theory. Kirchheimer extends this analysis then, and he tries to talk about the psychological motivations for racket formation, as well as it establishes the state as the entity that manages rackets, given its sovereign capacity for decision-making and its ability to regulate certain rackets as legitimate or illegitimate in a sort of ex nihilo fashion, right? And I think, again, as we think about this churn of rackets and their relation to the state, I think it's really important to also keep in mind that for Kirchheimer, you know, I think he both wants to resist the idea that the state is this sort of like completely separate sphere that manages rackets, the sort of, you know, bureaucracy of the bourgeoisie kind of, you know, conception. But also, he wants to resist the idea that big business just runs the state. Clearly, you know, I don't think he accepts either of those things. I think the sort of model that Kirchheimer builds is one in which the state plays a sort of management role, right? It deploys legitimacy and grants legitimacy to certain rackets in certain ways that bolsters its own sort of institutional power and delegitimizes or downplays other ones, right? So it sort of manages that churn, right, of the sort of turning over. And it's worth noting as well that, you know, I think Kirchheimer does establish, though, that the state's one sort of unique aspect in managing this sort of nexus of rackets is this sovereign decision-making power, you know, an idea he, you know, surely gets from his Dr. Vater Carl Schmitt. which that's a whole other paper about that relationship with those two. Um, so there is nothing inherently legitimate or illegitimate about a given racket, but that the state decides that it is so, right? So that's the sort of legitimation process. And here I think Kirchheimer agrees with Marcuse's sentiment that the political problems of rackets is one of institutional organization and not the content of the racket itself, right? In other words, we can move from the sort of normative basis where we say, well, this group is they're bad. This other one is good, and we like the way they do things and the way these other do things. Here's another example, I think, of how what Kirchheimer is doing is just sort of giving lie to this notion of institutionalist politics, especially in the American context, right? In other words, in the States, whenever things go wrong in the great financial crisis of 2008, the problem wasn't investment banking itself. It was that certain investment banks made really bad decisions, right? And so you elide, these structural critiques in favor of these sort of normative evaluations. So I realize, despite my best efforts, we always run out of time. It's a peculiarity of conferences. So I then sort of turn in this paper and onto my broader project, where I'm trying to argue that I think one thing that I think Marcuse in particular does really well, and this is apparent, from the 30s on, I think, especially when he gets to New York and starts engaging in American academia. I think Marcuse accepts, or at least takes seriously, some American institutional economics as a way to think through what it might mean to consider what is the outside of a racket and what that can look like. And you can find some interesting, I won't say allies, right? But there's interesting stuff out there. So for instance, John Kenneth Galbraith, Canadian turned American economist, an institutionalist, has a theory of what he calls the bezel, as in embezzlement, right? And for Galbraith, the bezel is just the sort of like cost of doing business, right? Like that's the little bit that you skim off the top, like the stuff that falls off the back of the truck, right? He just sort of institutionalizes this. This is a fact of American capitalism, and it's not that, it's not some sinister cabal, but it's just the cost of doing business. I think, for instance, that's it. I think that's something that Marcuse takes pretty seriously, and you see echoes of that in One Dimensional Man too, of course, right, where he talks about Galbraith and the affluent society. Let me just can't skip everything, crazy, and start to sort of conclude here. I want to argue that I think Kirchheimer's article in Quest of Sovereignty sets the stage to best analyze racket society, and to go back to a conversation between Licca and John when you had your Q&A, this idea of, well, are there good rackets? And I think you're right to suggest that no, right? There's some sort of definitional barrier here where, because you have to, submit totally to the domination of a racket, it's hard to think of that in an emancipatory way. Nevertheless, in this article in Quest of Sovereignty, Kirchheimer does sort of try to move past the to theorize out of the labor aristocracy of trade unionism to get to what he calls the ultima ratio of labor, which is a general strike. So I do think Kirchheimer is trying to figure out, right, like what is the countervailing force that can resist a racket? And in one sense, he's skeptical of the traditional labor organizing models to do that, but he also is trying to sort of think about what would it mean for labor to sort of form this general strike. Now, that, of course, is an enormously difficult task that involves all sorts of class consciousness and meta-organization. Oh, okay. I gave myself less time than you were giving me, so I'm maybe we'll end with a little time for questions. So Kirchheimer also notes that this theory of rackets then gets translated into the everyday life of citizens as a loss of agency, because rackets give lie to these myths of meritocracy and fairness, right? And this is just sort of a prima facie kind of truth, right? There's a nice liberal story about how merit will produce a certain outcome that you deserve, and rackets are baldly not doing that, right? Like they gatekeep and put people in positions whether or not they deserve it, and they do violence to other people. Um, so I think if we think about Kierkheimer's project doing that, along with Marcuse's engagement with American institutionalists of people like John Kenneth Galbraith, even before that, Thorstein Veblen, thinking about what institutional development looks like, why institutions get stronger, why they degrade, why they become, in Veblen's words, imbecilic. I think we can get a lens for critical theory to think through these questions of technology, automation, standardization in ways that could point to the political possibilities of qualitative change. That is to say, while many institutions are indeed rackets, aspire to be rackets, or exhibit racket-like behavior, it is difficult to theorize beyond the totality if we posit, as Horkheimer and Adorno did, that all organizations are basically rackets and that all rule is essentially gangster rule, right? So I'm just trying to find those qualitative edges where we can maybe find a foothold to think about what an alternative might look like is all. Instead, taking up questions of organized labor in its trade union sense should give us pause to think about how we theorize the labor process itself. What does it mean to strengthen working class power? It is less potent, I think, to simply assume that all trade unions are rackets. As well, when considering automation, luxury, notions of value, a critical theory infused with, I would say with folks like Galbraith and Veblen and these institutionalists, is a reminder that the overproduction of commodities due to standardization leads to privatization, not democracy. In the same vein, American institutionalism is well served by an engagement with the critical theory of rackets. General knowledge may not yield a general working class politics. In fact, I think we're pretty clear that's not going to be the case. But rather, we see a way in which insulated institutions try to solidify power within a state corporate nexus, right? In other words, they don't really need us, right? They're doing their own thing, playing their own game. And similarly, then, those in affluent society may take themselves to be well sated, liberated from want, and even as a system creates false needs, we may think we essentially are volunteering to remain in the thrall of rackets that overproduce this overabundance. But I think a dialectical engagement is strengthened then with a strong visibility of institutional arrangements and thinking through the labor process itself and going back to some of those old categories, as we've been saying, can lead to, I think, a more complete notion of racket theory. I'll leave it there.